Here's PragerU to make a horrible case for getting married.
Marriage might have been fine for your parents or grandparents, but of what value is it today? Isn't it, as more and more young people seem to be saying, just a piece of paper? Well, it turns out that piece of paper might be the most valuable thing you will ever own. Take the case of Doug Talby. At age 18, Talby worked a minimum wage job operating a press at a factory in Indiana and lived in his parents' basement. I didn't have a care in the world, Talby says. I didn't even have any bills.
This, the Prager folks will try to spin as a bad thing.
But after marrying at 19 and having kids, Talby's perspective changed. I had to step up and think about others and start taking care of them. Talby quit his factory job and joined the Army, where he made significantly more money and received housing and health care paid for by the military. Whenever he saw a chance at promotion, he pursued it. It meant more money and benefits for himself and his family. Recently, in a bid to further boost his family's income, he left the Army to work as a finance manager at a car dealership. He's now pulling in 6 figures.
So you should get married so that you will be saddled with more expenses? Gee, that sounds great. I know you say that this results in men making more money, but that's not much consolation given that they will then have to spend that money on paying for those additional expenses.
He's now pulling in 6 figures. Men who see no need to marry, or who are reluctant to marry until they make more money, could benefit from Talby's discovery.
So PragerU is against guys putting off marriage until they make more money? That doesn't sound very responsible or mature. It looks to me like they don't want a guy to be a man, as the title of the video suggests, but rather that they want guys to be saddled with this extra economic pressure so that they'll be good, obedient little worker bees. If they wait until they are already financially secure, the risks of getting fired are lower, so that's no good for employers. No, boys, you should get married when you're in as economically precarious a position as possible. That's the way the boss likes it. Also, the younger you marry, the higher the likelihood of divorce, so early marriage isn't even good for marriage. This is still more evidence that what this dude really wants is for people to be more easily exploitable than to actually have good lives.
Marriage has a transformative effect on the behavior, emotional health, and financial well-being of adults, especially men. Men who get married work harder and more strategically, and earn more money than their single peers from similar backgrounds.
Yeah, because if they have kids to feed and a spouse who will leave them over financial disputes, they're more desperate for work. If that's the reason they're working harder, I don't see why that's a good thing. And I certainly don't see why this should convince anyone to get married.
Marriage also transforms men's social world. They spend less time with friends and more time with family.
Spending less time with friends is something PragerU wants you to think is a good thing.
They go to bars less and to church more. In the words of Nobel Prize-winning economist George Akerlof, men settle down when they get married. If they fail to get married, they fail to settle down. My own research bears out Akerlof's view. Married men work about 400 hours more per year than single men with equivalent backgrounds. A Harvard study also found that married men were much less likely than their single peers to quit their current job unless they had another one lined up.
Okay, so if I get married, I get to enjoy not only a greater financial burden, but also less employment flexibility? How could I resist?
All this translates into a substantial marriage premium. On average, married men earn almost 20% more than their single peers.
How much more do they have to spend than their single peers?
Why is there such a substantial marriage premium? There are at least 4 important reasons. 1, after marrying, men assume a new identity. Marriage is one of the last rites of passage into manhood remaining in our society, argues sociologist Stephen Knock. He found that marriage engenders an ethic of responsibility among men.
PragerU wants you to look at these 2 guys and think that the guy in the suit is the one you'd rather be.
As well as a newfound sense of meaning and status in the world. 2, married men are motivated to maximize their income. This means having a different attitude toward their job. They work more hours and make better work choices. Studies find that men increase their work hours after marrying and reduce their hours after divorcing.
What you're arguing for isn't even consistent, because if you want men to work more hours, then you should advocate that they take steps to prevent divorce, one of the most effective of which is putting off marriage until later in life.
Sociologist Elizabeth Gorman concludes that married men are more likely to value higher-paying jobs than their single peers. 3, there is evidence that employers prefer and promote men who are married. Married men are often seen as more responsible and dedicated workers and are rewarded with more opportunities to advance.
Of course, employers love folks who are married because they won't rock the boat. If they have kids to feed and a spouse who will divorce them in the event that they get fired, there's more at stake for them, and thus it is easier to get them to obey. Also, while marriage may impose greater economic pressures incentivizing people to seek higher paying employment, the correlation between marriage and income is probably not all one way. It is also likely the case that if you are in a precarious economic position, especially if you have a lot of debt, finding someone who wants to marry you could be a challenge. Marriage doesn't just lead to higher incomes. Higher incomes make it easier to get married.
Fourth and finally, married men benefit from the advice and encouragement of their wives, who have an obvious interest in their success. There is no better motivator than your spouse. The tragedy is that despite all the good news we keep learning about the benefits of marriage, the institution is in retreat. In 1960, 72% of all adults ages 18 and older were married. Today, it's 49%. In 1960, the average age at which men married was 23. Today, it's 29. The consequences of this are negative across the income spectrum.
But divorce rates have been falling since the early 80s. There are fewer marriages, but the quality of those marriages appears to be increasing. The evidence seems to show that with marriage, like with most things, there's a trade-off between quantity and quality, and apparently PragerU prefers the former over the latter. Let's say there are economic consequences to less marriage. Are economic consequences really what should be foremost on a person's mind when they're deciding whether to get married?
But they are especially so for those in the lower and middle classes. Marriage is a clear path to a better life. It always has been. And now we have plenty of data to confirm it. But if you still don't believe me, just ask Doug Talby and millions like him.
You seem to define a better life in purely economic terms. If you are considering getting married, should economic considerations really be your first priority? Ought you not consider the fact that the younger you get married, the higher the chances your spouse will divorce you? Even if your first priority is the economic consequences of marrying, don't you think the likelihood of divorce is relevant to that? I imagine this Prager dude would say, well, if you find yourself in an unsuitable marriage because you married when you were young and naive, just suck it up and stay married anyway. First of all, that doesn't sound like a better life. Secondly, if your spouse wants to leave you, that's not something over which you have any control. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.